We've evolved to like stories. When our brain hears a story, it releases chemicals. Oxytocin, which is great for you because it creates an instant connection with the person you're speaking to. As soon as you start telling a story, if the other brain recognizes that a story is being told, they'll feel more connected to you immediately. It'll also release endorphins, which make you feel better about the environment you're in, and it releases a chemical that improves comprehension. So just think about that. By telling a story, you're sort of biohacking the brain of your audience to make them more predisposed to like you, be happy about you, and understand what you're saying. So automatically connection is going to happen just because you're changing brain chemistry by telling a story. And that's pretty great. It's the reason why we should always be telling stories.
Matthew Dix, I want to give you an existential bone welcome.
Thank you very much.
You are a world-renowned storyteller, author, teacher, husband, father, and friend. And I'm hoping that you'll become a mentor to me in all things human connection. And I want to thank you for joining me today. I am so excited because you come recommended as world-class in all of these areas. And I have such a long way to go in growing in my ability to relate to humans.
So it really is a challenge for you to relate to humans being who you are. That's a real thing.
Oh, yes, because as it is, I've had to defy the lineage of my ancestors. I have become vegan, so I am no longer living on human blood. And humans are still afraid of me. They see what I am and they think that I will be acting upon them and that I may be the beginning of their demise. So I need to let them know otherwise, let them know that I am a different species of vampire altogether, and that I'm also terribly alone.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I have to say it's an uphill climb for you. You know, I'm thrilled to hear that you're not living on human blood anymore, but essentially that makes you a former serial killer as opposed to a current serial killer. So, you know, you certainly have a reputation that you'll have to overcome, but perhaps with some human connection, that might happen.
Thank you so much for seeing me and getting me in that way.
Well, thank you so much for not killing any of my friends or family and enjoying broccoli, kale.
Yes. And I do favor the red vegetables and fruits like beets and blood oranges, but I'm learning to appreciate the leafy greens.
Okay, great. All right, well, tell me, how can I help you?
Well, I have heard that there's something called stories that can really help increase human connection and that you're the right person to ask about that. Would you mind telling me and teaching me about stories today?
Sure. So you're not even really sure what a story is?
Correct. What's a story?
Well, I mean, I'm glad you've come to me because a lot of people don't understand fundamentally what a story is. I think when you meet most human beings, when you're not eating them anymore and having a conversation with them, you'll discover that with most human beings, they tend to think that something happens to them over the course of time. And then they tell you what happened, and therefore they've told you a story, right? And that does not amount to a story. That's just reporting on your life. And it turns out no one has ever wanted you to report on your life other than perhaps maybe a spouse or a mother, but even they don't have a lot of time for that. So a story isn't about stuff that happened over time. It's about a particular moment in time when something changed fundamentally about your existence. For you, it might be the moment when you decided, I'm going vegan. That would amount to a story because you were once one thing. And then a moment later, you had decided you were going to be another thing. That amounts to a story. So any kind of change over time, it tends to be either transformational, which you actually experienced. Vegan is not what you were before, so you have transformed into something new, or a realization, which tends to be the more common kind of story, which is I used to think one thing, and then some stuff happened, and now I think a new thing. That's essentially what a story is. So we're trying to pay attention to our lives and looking for those moments when we feel something shift inside us. That's a story.
That's incredible. So it does involve paying attention to our lives to find those stories. Is that correct?
Yes, storytellers are self-centered in a very positive way, meaning they actually have interest in themselves and why they are the way they are and how they got to the place they are today. Most human beings, sadly, lack this quality. They tend to move through life and something stirs inside them. And then instead of pausing and considering it, they go and get the milk and then put the gas in the car and head home. And whatever moment they happen to have is now lost to them forever. And so to be a great storyteller, you actually have to be attuned to your life. You have to be curious about your life and you have to constantly be questioning why you do the things you do, why you feel the way you feel, why the way you think the way you think. All of those things amount to the gathering, the collecting, and the telling of great stories.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great learning point right there, that when I feel uncomfortable, I shouldn't just shift into feeding. I should actually focus on what it is I'm feeling, become curious about it, see what I might be realizing, and maybe observe the things going on around that could be a part of a story.
Yes, and hold on to those moments because sometimes the meaning of a moment reveals itself immediately. You instantly understand, oh, I get it. Sometimes I've literally sat behind the wheel of my car for 10 minutes thinking about something that happened to me, and then it hits me. And sometimes, actually, just recently, I had a moment that took place when I was maybe 11 years old that I have wondered about my whole life. And 4 days ago, I finally figured out what it meant. And now I can tell the story. But that was a lifetime of pondering before I actually discovered the meaning behind it. And so we have to hold on to these moments because sometimes it takes decades to figure out what they actually mean.
Incredible. So that is a nonlinear, decade-long, meaning-making moment that you had.
Yes, exactly.
And how do you grab a hold of the stories over time?
Well, there's lots of ways to do it. One of them is you have to sort of pay attention to each day that you're living from this moment on, right? So every day I'm doing something called homework for life, which is basically paying attention to my life and asking myself if I had to tell stories about things that happened today, what would those stories be? Even if they really wouldn't amount to stories, they don't feel very story like. Essentially, I'm moving through my day and asking myself, what did someone say that made a difference in my life or even just sort of entertained me in some way? What did I see differently? How did I think differently? What did I do today that makes today different than yesterday? I've never spoken to a vegan vampire today. So, for example, in my homework for life, I will probably be putting, I had an odd conversation with a former serial killer turned vegan vampire about storytelling. That would be a thing that I have never done before. So it becomes a moment. So we're paying attention to the moments we're having today and recording them because otherwise they'll always be lost to us. But there's also opportunities to look into the past and start asking yourself about how one moment from today might connect to the past. So we've left a lot of things behind that we want to recover as much as we can, but we want to be paying attention to today at the same time.
Okay. And given that I'm still flipping from my nights being my days, is it okay if I do my homework for life at night?
Yes, what my recommendation is that you do it before you go to sleep. Sleep is actually physically and neurologically designed to wash away the day, process the day, and sort of reset your brain. And so, if you allow yourself to go to sleep before reflecting on the day, you are likely to lose some things. So, what I actually do is throughout the day now, I am often writing down things that I have noticed. So, I used to wait till the end of the day and then say, okay, what happened today? Now I'm basically taking my phone, if I'm around my computer, if I have a notepad, I'm jotting down things. So at the end of the day, it is collecting all those things onto a spreadsheet and then asking myself, what might I have missed over the course of the day? And so more than one item in a day is very common for me. I average about 7.8 moments per day right now. So if you're finding more than one, that's fantastic.
That's incredible. It sounds as if you really understand the value of harvesting your stories on a daily basis all day long.
Yes. Well, let me ask you a question. How old are you?
A vampire doesn't like to say her age. And it can be quite a frightening number to the average human because I do live for millennia.
Okay. So, one of the things that human beings experience, and perhaps vampires, is the idea that time flies, that a year can go by in sort of a blink of an eye. That's not actually true. What happens is rather than time flying, it just goes unaccounted for. So, if I was to ask you, how many things can you remember from the year 1436, right? Given your age, perhaps you were alive that year. And if you thought back, you might be able to think of maybe a handful of moments from that year. If I was to ask you honestly, how much do you remember from 2018? You would probably, if you're really good, you might remember somewhere between 25 to 50 moments from that year, which really means what you've done is you've taken 365 days and you've shrunken them down to 25 or 50 days. That's why time feels like it flies, not because it actually does. All you have to do is ask someone who's incarcerated in prison or someone who's doing recess duty. Time does not fly in either one of these cases, right? It doesn't fly ever. It only flies to us because we fail to account for our days. So for you, you're very lucky. You have a long and probably storied past to look back into to recover those days. But I suspect, let's say you were a millennia old, it probably doesn't feel like a millennia. It should ideally feel like that. But because you haven't been doing homework for life and collecting those stories and holding on to them, time has flown by for you too. So I suggest that from this point on, you stop doing that to yourself and you start holding on to your days.
I think I'm going to start holding on to my night days and my day nights and start harvesting stories because I trust the value of what you're saying and your reasons for saying this.
I have to tell you, it's a little disconcerting to hear a vampire use the word harvest. It just doesn't feel like the right word to me. Just giving you some communication tips for the future.
Well, I am working on my language skills and learning to soften them so that I don't frighten humans.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that might be step one in your communication. Excellent.
Thank you. And would you mind, given that you are this storytelling expert, going back in time in your own lifetime and letting me know where it was that you first discovered the power of stories?
Well, it's hard to say. I know that I was paying attention to it at a very young age. I know that when I was about 10 years old, I went to see E.T., the extraterrestrial, in the movie theater. And I came home angry because it's a pretty perfect movie, except for one scene. And I hated the one scene. I hate it to this day. And I was so upset about it that I wrote a letter to Steven Spielberg telling him, "You've written a nearly flawless movie." I thought he had written it because that was my mindset at the time. "You've written a flawless movie, but you've got this one stupid scene that's breaking your movie." And I suggested to him that in the future, when he produces a movie, he send it to me first so I can tell him where his acts of stupidity are so I could help correct it. So at an early age, I was obviously sort of focused on how stories worked. I think that probably I started telling stories as a young boy because I wasn't getting a lot of attention as a kid. My parents were sort of not fully equipped to take care of children when I was a kid. So I was kind of on my own a lot. I was the oldest of three and then later five when I picked up a couple of step siblings. So I was sort of in charge of people. And I just felt like there was a lot of pressure on me and I wasn't getting the eyeballs that I wanted from people who should be sort of looking in my direction and taking care of me. But what I discovered was that if I told stories to my parents, to my teachers, to my friends, they paid attention. And I quickly discovered that if I told the stories about my stupidity, my failure, my embarrassment, and my shame, those are the ones they love the most. And so I eliminated very early on in my life the fear of telling stories that might not cast me in a positive light. I came to understand that stories that cast you in a positive light are often not enjoyed by audiences because nobody wants to hear you brag. But they're
Mm.
more than happy to hear about you tripping on the banana peel and failing to get the girl and crashing the car. Those are much more entertaining stories. So I think as a boy looking for connection, I was telling stories in hopes of, garnering the attention that I needed.
Mm. So even as you began experimenting with storytelling, your interest was always in harvesting human connection. So as you went on to do the storytelling, you began to observe what worked and get better at it.
Yeah, for sure. I think part of it is I'm a good listener. I'm an auditory learner, meaning I don't really remember what I see very well at all, to be honest. I don't have much of a visual memory. I
Well,
will
that's
remember
good. Then
you.
you won't be upset about this.
Well, I will remember you. I remember things that I've never seen before, but I don't have much of a visual memory, but my auditory memory is exceptionally strong. I remember most things that I hear. And so I think that helped too. So when I was a kid, I was listening to people tell stories and I was recognizing which stories were good and which were bad. And not in any strategic or thoughtful way, but I think inherently, sort of, unconsciously, I was absorbing the strategies that worked well and discarding the ones that did not work well. So, I think early on I was finding that craft, although I wouldn't have been able to tell you at the time that that was what was happening.
Well, it is very inspiring to hear that you began, you sort of stumbled upon storytelling as a tool to increase your connection with others, and then you started to hone that craft so that you could increase the connection that you had. Do you think that that's true universally? Like, would it work for me too?
I don't think that people inherently unconsciously can absorb these strategies. I think that people who tend to become good storytellers without study, without sort of the practice and the teaching, they tend to either be outstanding listeners, people who really listen well and absorb information on an auditory level, people who need attention that don't have it, and especially at a young age. And then there's those like nerds who pay a lot of attention to SNL and other sort of like humor things as a kid. They tend to become very good storytellers too. The theater kids, right? So you're either a theater kid, you are neglected, or you have a strong auditory processing skill. I think those are the people who tend to become great storytellers.
Well, I'm just going to take your expert word for it that storytelling is a secret way to get human connection and break out of isolation. And what I hear you saying is that it doesn't come automatically, that there's a skill and a craft that I might need to work at.
I do think that, yes, I think that if you want to be good at storytelling and you don't have one of those inherent qualities, you are probably a C minus storyteller who can certainly level up very quickly through some instruction. Yes, I think that's true.
Okay, so how would I go about learning to tell stories?
Well, first, you're going to collect those stories because I think the person who has the most stories to tell tends to be one of the better storytellers in the room. So you don't want to be someone who's telling the same story over and over again. So you want to have lots of practice. You want to get lots of reps, right? So after that, what I'm always telling people is the first thing you want to think about when telling a story is who you're telling the story to. Oftentimes, when I hear storytellers describe what they're trying to do with me, they often say, well, here's what I want to say. And I always have to tell them that's actually irrelevant. What you want to say is not really storytelling. Storytelling is asking yourself, what does the audience want and need to hear, which is often different than what you want to say. Those two things are often in opposition to each other. So when I am on a stage, the difference between what I want to say and what my audience wants and needs me to say are often very different. So the first question you ask yourself is, who am I talking to? And you try to craft your story based upon the audience you're standing in front of, whether it is a vegan vampire or 1,000 people at a Brooklyn theater or a conference room with a bunch of corporate people, or you're on a date with someone and you want to win her over. All of those things require a different kind of story and a different version of every story. So we have to be thinking in that way.
Wow. So you actually have to think of your audience first.
Yes. Otherwise, you're thinking of yourself. And if you're only saying things that you want to say, you're almost assuredly failing as a storyteller.
So there is a facet of self-expression, and you're noting that things that you're going through, the realizations you're having in your homework for life, you may want to share that, but in doing so, you can't forget that you have an audience.
Right. The first person who hears any of our stories is ourselves. So we get to tell soup to nuts everything we want to say. I say it to myself when I'm on the bike, in the shower, driving the car. My brain gets to hear the full story. And then I say to myself, I still want to reflect truth and authenticity and vulnerability. I want to capture the essence of the story, but there's just parts that don't belong in the story for the audience I'm speaking to. My wife was very good at helping me with this early on. I'd tell her a version of a story and she'd say, that's great, but why did you spend 30 seconds talking about Pop Tarts? And I'd say, well, I mean, it was funny, wasn't it? And she'd say, it was hilarious, but it didn't help you get to the end of your story. Right. So the Matthew Dix truth is I want to make people laugh all the time. The truth of a story is if I'm just trying to make people laugh, I'm telling a bad story. Right. Humor, like all things in stories, should be deployed strategically rather than just to make me feel good. When people laugh at me, I feel good. So it's a drug, right? But I can't access that drug all the time or I'm telling a bad story.
Oh, okay. So you explained how we need to capture the stories on a daily basis. We need to become aware of the audience. And what are the other elements we have to learn for storytelling?
Well, I guess what we want to think about is probably the next most important thing is understanding how a story fundamentally works, meaning the frame of a story. So if we're going to tell a story, we decide something has happened to us, like you have gone from serial killer to vegan, right? When you do that, what we always start with is the end of the story. We always start with what we're trying to say. Most people start at the beginning, which means they're sort of fumbling around and probably never really getting to an end. So storytellers say, what am I trying to say? What is the point that I am trying to make? Right? I have to be able to sort of say that idea in a sentence or maybe two. I have to be able to state out loud what the point of my story is. Once I have that, that's the end of my story. That's great because most stories don't ever end, right? They sort of like fade away or they get interrupted or time runs out. So we want an end. And then once we have an end, we want to find a good beginning. And the good beginning is always the opposite of the end. That's how we show change over time. So the opposite of being a vegan is being a meat eater, right? So that is your story essentially.
A human meat eater.
Right, a human meat eater, yes, or a bloodsucker. I don't know if that's an offensive phrase for you.
Not at all.
Okay, so you once killed humans and now you kill carrots, right? That is, so in the end, what happens is stories, the beginnings and endings of stories are in opposition to each other, right? The classic example in human terms, I don't know if these exist in vampire terms, is the romantic comedy, which is two people at the beginning of a movie are not in love. And by the end of the movie, they are in love, right? That is a simple formula that works again and again and again in books and television and movies. We want to watch two people not be in love and then be in love. That's opposites. But it works in all movies, all books, all stories that are told, everything you've ever seen. If you've ever been to Broadway, I don't know if that's a thing you've been able to get out to yet. All of these stories that we tell in every format essentially do that. We start in one place and we end in somewhat the opposite in order to tell the story.
Well, my family has held box seats for millennium.
Oh, I see. So let me give you a small bit of communication advice, Vegan Vampire. That's what's known as a brag. It's known as a sort of an economic brag. You're establishing your financial hierarchy, and you should know it's probably always poorly received. Not by me, I am fine, but in communication terms, sort of saying that you own a Mercedes is never well received by anyone.
Thank you so much for enlightening me on that, Matthew. And I was actually just trying to respond to your question about whether I'd ever been to Broadway or not, but I can see how socially awkward I am, and I have a long way to go in softening myself. So
well, if you want to ever give me tickets to your box seat, that's a great way to offer it. So let's rephrase what you just said. Rather than I'll have you know that my family has had box seats. Instead, you could say something like, "Oh, you love Broadway? My family has box seats. We'd love to have you sometime." That would be what's known in human terms as a humble brag, which is sort of like you're indicating your status, but you're indicating it in such a way that it is more readily received. It is still a humble brag and it will be identified as such, but it is better than the first version of what you said.
I like it very much. And I will have my hearse driver contact your wife about that.
Excellent.
Are there other elements to the story that I've yet to learn about?
Yes, there are many. I mean, quite honestly, Vegan Vampire, I could speak for, dozens and dozens of hours on storytelling and not be done with all the things that I understand about it. But also being an elementary school teacher for 27 years, I know that people can't process sort of large amounts of information in one setting. So I think if you actually just take what I taught you so far and run with that, you're going to be better than most of the storytellers because most people aren't thinking any of the things I just shared with you. Most of them are sort of plodding through life and reporting on their lives, and that's about it. So do some of those things, and then perhaps once you get excellent at those, I can talk to you about suspense and surprise and stakes and humor and chronological structures and all of these things that come into play later. But start with good beginnings and good endings and actually saying something of meaning. You'll be doing a really excellent job at that point.
That's exciting. Although I will confess that I just heard blah, 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 stakes, blah, blah, blah. Made me a little bit triggered there, but that's okay.
Okay. And it is spelled Stakes. So it is the steak that you should probably avoid.
Thank you. I will. So if I become better and better at storytelling, how is that going to help my connection with humans?
Oh, well, in a multitude of ways. Let's talk about the brain, first of all, right? So when we tell a story to another human being, or I guess to a vampire, presuming that your brain operates like mine, brain chemistry fundamentally changes when we begin telling a story. This is because of evolution. For 200,000 years that human beings have lived on this planet in the form that we have now, the only way we could communicate information from one generation to the next was through stories. And it's the only way we survived, right? There's a lot of animals that are faster than us, stronger than us, have sharper teeth than us. We should have died off a long time ago. But because we could actually communicate with language, we were able to teach one generation what we learned and move it on to the next. But that was through oral storytelling. We couldn't write like in books and even on stone tablets until the very recently in terms of human history. It's a very recent phenomenon. So we've evolved to like stories. When our brain hears a story, it releases chemicals, oxytocin, which is great for you because it creates an instant connection with the person you're speaking to. As soon as you start telling a story, if the other brain recognizes that a story is being told, they'll feel more connected to you immediately. It'll also release endorphins, which make you feel better about the environment you're in. And it releases a chemical that improves comprehension. So just think about that. By telling a story, you're sort of biohacking the brain of your audience to make them more predisposed to like you, be happy about you, and understand what you're saying. So automatically connection is going to happen just because you're changing brain chemistry by telling a story. That's pretty great. It's the reason why we should always be telling stories.
Well, I am learning more and more about biohacking. I find it fascinating. So this is exciting to know that storytelling is another way of hacking the brain and creating a profound and powerful connection.
Yes. And then once you do that and you're telling a story, you'll discover that very strange things will begin to happen. There's a phrase we use that says relationships move at the speed of vulnerability, meaning the more vulnerable you are, the quicker you are at getting to vulnerability, the faster you'll have a deep and meaningful connection with another human being. And so if you start telling stories and biohacking people's brains, you'll discover that people feel deeply and oddly connected with you in ways that are both profound and extraordinary and also somewhat disconcerting at times. I've had odd instances where people will come up to me and there's a woman who once told me that she can't go into people's homes without stealing something every time she goes into the home. And I was the only person she'd ever told that to. Right. And I didn't tell a story about stealing or theft or anything. I'd actually told a parenting story. But this 40-year-old woman decided I was going to be the one she was going to share her mental illness with, essentially. I had a woman once at the end of a weekend with me come up to me and say, I'm leaving my husband. I've known it for a long time, but I haven't told anyone. I'm going to tell you first. And I had to tell her, I don't think I should be the first person to hear this. I think you probably have a friend who knows you better than me. But what happened over the course of a weekend is she felt deeply connected to me because I was telling stories and asking her to tell stories. So even though she has very good friends, at the end of the weekend, she thought, God, he knows me so well and I know him so well. Not really true, but that's the magic of a story. Suddenly you will realize that people want to hang out with you and they want to tell you things. And sometimes it's, like I said, it's profound and extraordinary. And sometimes it's a little disconcerting, but you take those weird ones because there's so much goodness that comes with it as well.
Mm. Well, you're using a lot of vocabulary that I relate to: strange, odd, weird, disconcerting. But you're also bringing in new elements that sound absolutely wonderful: meaning and connection and vulnerability. These are just so new to me, but I do hope to learn them.
Well, it's not hard. The trick of all of storytelling in terms of getting people's attention is to be entertaining. And there's lots of ways to be entertaining. But ultimately, if you're saying things that actually matter and you're saying things that most people are sort of unwilling to speak about, those shames, embarrassments, failures, like I learned as a kid, you'll discover that people will be drawn to you right away. The fear that people have is if I talk about an embarrassment, people will think less of me. That is always not true, but it is what people think. And sort of there's a rational and understandable reason why. You sort of don't want to tell people about your dumbest moments or they'll think you're dumb, except that's not true because everyone is dumb. Everyone has embarrassing moments. Everyone has moments of shame. So when you're willing to share them, it allows people to see that they are normal and human too, that the embarrassments and shames that they're carrying with themselves are not nearly as burdensome or unique as they once thought. So it's just a matter of being brave enough to do it. And the only way to sort of find that bravery is to do it once. I always compare it to going off the high dive. When I was a kid, 12-foot high dive, probably illegal these days, but back in the 1980s, 12-foot high dive, when you hit the water, you had to have your hands out or you would have smashed into the bottom. But I remember watching hundreds of kids go off that high dive, and I stood there and thought, why can't I do this? Like, I see all these people doing it, and they're all fine. Everyone's coming out of the water smiling. Why can't I do it? So finally, I got myself up the ladder to the edge of the diving board. And even then, on the edge of the board, I had to go off now. I had no choice. Like, there's too much shame involved with going back. It was almost impossible. And the crazy thing is, after I went off the board and I hit the water and everything was fine, and I actually had a good time when I came out of the water, it was still hard the second time. It took me time and time again before I could just go up without thinking about it. And that's what storytelling is. It is the first time you make the leap and you're willing to be vulnerable and authentic and try something new. It's really hard. And that doesn't mean that the second time is going to be a piece of cake, right? The second time it may be challenging too, but eventually you get to the point that you can do it without the fear that you have right now.
Mm. I think you just did something very sneaky, Matthew Dix. I think you told me a story about storytelling to teach me through your own life story, and I do feel so connected to you now.
Well, I hope that connection is entirely unrelated to mealtime.
Well, I've heard that you love the McRib.
I do love the McRib. It's a fantastic. I worked at McDonald's for 10 years managing those restaurants while I was sort of struggling through my life. And yeah, I had an Egg McMuffin for breakfast this morning. Yeah.
So I've heard of this thing called origin stories, and I feel as if it would be a really wonderful thing to know my own, given that really I've been reborn in a sense as I've changed from the patterns of my ancestors and the way that I was into this whole new creature of a sort. Could you tell me anything about that?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring it up. Oftentimes people think they're looking for their origin story non-plural, and I always think that's a silly thing because we have a multitude of origin stories, right? So you have an origin story about your transition from murderer to leaf eater, right? That is a transition that you have made, an origin story. But you certainly have other origin stories too. You have origin stories throughout your entire life on all the things that you've sort of learned along the way. When it comes to an origin story, what I try to do is identify what origin I'm trying to speak of, because we have lots of different ones. I have origin stories related to becoming a father and becoming a writer and becoming a storyteller and becoming a teacher. And each one of those aspects of my life have a multitude of origin stories contained therein, right? So if I wanted to talk about becoming a novelist or a writer of books, I have an origin story from Easter when I was 10 years old, and I have a moment when I was 17 years old in an English class, and I have a moment on an elliptical in a gym when I was maybe 28 that transformed the way I became a writer. And I could keep going. So I have multitudes of origin stories related to each aspect of my life, and they're super useful, especially if you're looking to do anything in business or interviewing for jobs or speaking in front of classes or just connecting with people in general. What I always want to do is tell the right story. So if someone asks me, how did you become a writer? I ask myself, well, who was the person? Again, considering the audience.
Mm-hmm.
As a teenager, I'm going to tell the story about when I was 17 in Mr. Compo's class. If it's someone who's like feeling like they're never going to make it, I'm going to tell the story about Bally's Fitness when I had a moment on an elliptical when everything changed. If it's the struggle is I can't find my process, I'm going to tell a story about being in Boca Raton with my wife and her grandmother and that moment of origin for me. So having a multitude of origin stories around a multitude of our identities allows us to sort of pick and choose what is most effective in terms of communicating and connecting with people, right? So if you read a comic book, like Spider-Man has an origin story. It is a spider bit him and he became Spider-Man. He actually has more than that though, because then his Uncle Ben dies and that's a different version of his origin story, right? So one gives him his superpowers, one gives him his sort of identity and purpose in life. But even that's two. This is Spider-Man, like one of the greatest superheroes of all time. He's got a lot more, but because it's a comic book and because it's written for kids and because it's sort of two-dimensional, he lacks some of the depth that I think a real Spider-Man would have. We have depth. We have depth beyond the comic book pages. And so I think it's worth your time sitting down and saying, what identities do I sort of exist within? And then what are the stories that have led me along the path of that identity? Identify all those origin stories, sort of put them together in your mind. And then when you're ready to tell one, ask yourself, who's standing in front of me and which one will land the best?
So, yes, instead of harming the person in front of me, I'll be seeking to tailor what I'm communicating in such a way that I create that connection and a meaningful connection and a powerful connection that lasts.
Yes. And maybe, one of the things you might not be accustomed to being a previous blood-sucking vampire is the idea that we want to keep our mouths closed as long as possible, right? So whenever I enter a room or a meeting or anything for the first time, I try to be the last person to speak. What I'm trying to do is accumulate as much information about the people around me so that when I do tell a story, it is the most informed choice possible. So I'll ask lots of open-ended questions. I'll allow other people to speak. I'm always thinking about what's happening underneath. There's a principle called Grice's razor, and that is the idea that what people say and what they mean are often entirely different things. And so what you want to be doing as a human who's trying to make a connection is you want to listen to what people say, but constantly be asking, what are they really trying to say? The surface level conversation that exists in this world is never reflective of what people are really trying to express. And the better you get at asking yourself, what does this person really mean? The better you're going to be at choosing a proper story to connect with them.
Incredible. Well, I got a little distracted by the word razor, but I will think more deeply on what you've said, and I will practice this, looking for the deeper meaning of what it is that people are trying to say when I get around them.
Excellent. It'll help you greatly.
Excuse the humble brag, but I am very renowned in the cricket and the firefly kingdom at the moment. And they would want to know how they can go on to learn more about storytelling. And if you have a resource for that, let me just say that I have been taking a good bite into your two books, one about storytelling and one about how to be creatively productive. So what can you tell me more about how people can learn from you?
Well, Vegan Vampire, the first thing I'll tell you is, I have a third book on storytelling. So, once you've done those two, there will be a third that you can go and read.
I did not know that. I'm so excited.
So, I write books on storytelling. Oddly enough, I wrote my first book on storytelling because Well, I had a workshop before the pandemic. That was that terrible time in human history. I don't know if it affected vampires, but it affected humans. So back in like 2017, 2018, 2019, I used to have week-long workshops here in Connecticut, which is really not a place you ever really want to come to. There's not a lot to do here. And so I'd have these boot camps where people would come for a week. And back in 2018, I had 10 people come to my boot camp. That was the limit. And I had two people from China and one person from Vancouver and one person from San Diego and two people from Chicago. Like all these people from all over the world came to Connecticut to meet with me about storytelling. And I thought, this is crazy. Like you should not have to come from China to Connecticut to learn from me. And so that's when I decided to write Storyworthy. I thought I need to write a book that is reflective of if you spent a week with me learning about storytelling, this is what you would learn. Therefore, you don't need to get on a plane and fly to boring to Connecticut. Thankfully, people are willing to visit with me still and learn about storytelling. And the book became a lot more than just sort of a week with me. It became, a much more expansive look into storytelling. But it certainly is a good way to dive into storytelling. And if you're an auditory learner like me and you want to get the audiobook, I actually narrate it. So you can get, I don't know, 8 or 10 hours of me talking to you about storytelling. So that would be a good place to start. Start with one of my books. The book you had up, Some Day Is Today, is about creative productivity. That is the idea of if you want to make better use of your time and you want to actually produce things that don't exist today but will exist tomorrow, that is the book that answers that question. The question I get asked the most in the world is, how do you get all the things done that you do in the time that you have? And I would always say, well, if you have 18 hours, I'd be happy to help you learn from me. But no one ever wanted that. So I wrote a book to answer that question.
Mm. And when people aren't able to come to Connecticut and they want to learn storytelling, how do they do that?
Oh, well, beyond my books, they can go to my website, storyworthy.com. I actually have a totally free academy. You can jump into it and spend hours with a video version of me, a recorded version of me that teaches many of the lessons that are in my books and in my online courses. So you can just go to storyworthy.com and jump into the free academy and learn a lot without ever paying a dime. And then if you ever want to extend beyond there, I have courses you can purchase. You can become a member of the site and have access to everything. You can get individual coaching with me, all of these things. But I think honestly, all of that should be far down the line. I think it all begins with sort of being attuned to storytelling, doing homework for life, maybe reading one of my books, maybe jumping into my free academy. But I think practice is the most important thing we can do. Start telling more stories more often to more people. I think that is probably the best way you're going to become a better storyteller.
And is it okay if I begin telling all my stories to my hearse driver at first?
Anyone is fine. One of my favorite stories right now is I'm working with someone, a former NBA player in California, and I play a storytelling game in workshops, and I taught him this game on how to sort of find and tell stories quickly. And he picks up his son every day, and he has a 45-minute drive home right now because his house was burned down in the Palisades fire.
Oh.
And so he's actually bringing his son very far away to school. And so he plays this game with his son on the way home. And so his audience right now is not his hearse driver, but he is essentially the hearse driver driving his son back and forth. But he's told me that he's become a much better storyteller because he gets daily practice as a result of this. And he learns meaningful things about his son that he never would have known had he not been engaged in this game. So it doesn't matter who you're telling it to. And remember, the most important audience for every story you ever tell is yourself. So if you're standing in the shower and telling yourself a story, that is also a useful way to practice.
Okay, so you can start by telling yourself and then think of your audience. And it doesn't matter who they are, but once you think of who they are, then you tailor it to them and you just need to practice.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Practice. The more stories you tell, the better you will get. It's just like shooting a free throw in basketball. The more you shoot, the better your average increases.
Okay. I guess I need to learn what basketball is, but I'll save that for another day.
So one of the things I do is I work with attorneys. And sometimes I help attorneys like fashion an opening statement or a closing statement, but I've also worked with attorneys' witnesses to help them sort of craft what they're going to say on the stand a little bit better. But what attorneys have noticed is that when I'm working with their witnesses, I'm able to get their witnesses to say things that the attorneys don't know. Like I managed to sort of harvest more information from these witnesses. And so the first time this happened, I was in Vermont with a bunch of attorneys, and this guy, Troy, said to me, "How are you getting all these people to talk like this?" And I said, "I have no idea. Pay attention to what I do in the next few. Take notes," which is what he did. And after a few more witnesses, we sat down and I said, "So what am I doing?" And he said, "You're doing almost nothing." He said, "Basically, what I think you're doing is you say a lot of things like, 'Oh, really? Oh, isn't that interesting? Uh-huh. Oh, can you tell me more?'" He said, "You almost never ask a question. You just prompt them to continue talking." And he said, "The other thing you do is at some point, you always tell a personal story that connects in some way to what they just said, right? And as soon as you tell that personal story, so one woman had said, 'Well, I lost my mom when I was about 30.'" And she continued to speak for a while. And when she was done speaking, I said, "Listen, I lost my mom when I was 32, so I know how hard that is. I'm so sorry." And they said at that moment, that woman just opened up and spilled the beans, right? It
Mm.
was me sharing a little bit of connection with someone. And that's not something attorneys ever think of doing. They never think of like talking about their wife and their kids and their mothers and their lives. They're always just seeking information rather than sort of creating a door through which a witness can open. So when you're trying to connect with people, vegan vampire, one of the things you might want to do is to just get people talking so that they have the opportunity to share as much as possible with you, so that eventually you'll think, "Oh, I know what this person wants, needs, what will impact this person the most." And you might find yourself with your first friend.
Please call me VV for short. I feel so close to you now. And I'm very inspired to hear that story and I want you to know something. One of my other teacher mentors is a man named James Pyle, and he teaches about human intelligence and data collecting. And he's also a master of connection and conversation. And I've learned from him that there's something called elicitation, and there's a strategy called quid pro quo. So when you meet your lawyers again, you can tell them that what you're doing is quid pro quo from the art of elicitation.
All right. Well, quid pro quo, isn't that a legal word already? So I'll be happy to introduce that legal word in a new way to them. But I do think it's an easy way to get people talking. And not that I made any friends with those witnesses, but I suspect if I spent a little more time with them, I probably would have. And not humble bragging here, but just legitimately bragging. I have a lot of friends. A loneliness expert just interviewed me for 3 hours. And the reason she interviewed me was because she knows me a little bit, and she recognized me as one of the more connected people in the world that she knows. So she wanted to know how I had accumulated so many friends and connections. So, there was lots of reasons that we discovered how I have done this, but one of them is through storytelling. So if you're looking to make connections, telling stories is a really good start.
Well, that's why I've come to you. I'm also very reassured to know there is a loneliness expert available. And I'm going to do what you said. I'm going to practice storytelling with myself. I'm going to look for my stories on a daily, nightly basis. And I'm going to think of my audience and begin to cultivate empathy for what it is they might like to hear from me and why they might like to hear it. And is it okay if we continue this conversation at another time?
Of course. I mean, provided that you don't run into any untimely stakes or silver bullets or holy water, provided that you have another millennium or two ahead of you, yes, that would be lovely.
Okay. Is it okay if I tell you one or two jokes before I go?
Oh, I'd love to hear your jokes. I mean, I might not like them, but I would love to hear them.
What kind of candy do vampires eat?
What kind of candy do vampires eat? I'm looking for a candy with the word blood in it. I thought of Red Hots, but that's not close enough. All right, what kind of candy do vampires eat?
Suckers!
Of course, of course.
Okay.
Although, if you're trying to make friends, maybe that's not the right joke, because that is once again reinforcing your previous life.
That's true. Well, I am in recovery, as you know.
Right. Yeah.
So this might actually make you feel reassured. So, what is a vampire's favorite fruit?
What is a vampire's favorite fruit? Well, is it a blood orange?
No, it's a nectarine.
Once again, I'm not sure if that one is making me feel any more reassured. Actually, just hearing that you're in recovery is a little disconcerting to me because I've had many friends in recovery and I know that relapses occasionally happen. So I'm
Oh,
hoping that, I'm hoping that your recovery sticks.
it will, because I've had a spiritual awakening and I am now of the light. Rest assured, Matthew Dix, I am so grateful to you for this time spent today. I have learned so much. I know that my human interactions, my human connection will benefit so much from what I've learned today. And please, before you go, let me give you another existential bone blessing.
Thank you very much, Vivi. It is a pleasure to have spent time with you.
And we will meet again soon.